So I know, let me get ahead of this question. Every country has espionage to some degree or the other. What makes the Chinese Communist Party's espionage activities different from America?
Well, pretty much all countries do espionage, the Vatican included.
Really? Against the devil?
Yeah, but they have a good boss, so they usually find out everything. But China, the CCP in particular, uses what I call whole of society approach to espionage. It's not spy versus spy as it used to be, right? Not the CIA and the KGB and other intelligence services. China incorporates all of society to conduct espionage. In fact, it mandates it through its national intelligence law. So it's not just the Ministry of State Security or the People's Liberation Army General Military Intelligence Department, or their joint intelligence department now. It is the thousands of people in state-owned enterprises. It is companies. It is academics. It's anyone the CCP calls on and says, we want to know this. And they don't have the right of refusal. So you're dealing with an entire different base of espionage that, to be frank, the United States and most other countries are just completely unprepared for.
Yeah, one of the things I found really surprising when I read your book is that only 16% of the espionage cases that you had researched originated with the Ministry of State Security, which I guess I think of the MSS as being like the CIA and NSA combined.
The spy guys.
Yeah. And maybe DIA, which nobody knows about anyway. But like, so MSS is basically all those, but they're only doing less than, 1/5 or 1/6 of the overall espionage that's the CCP is conducting.
Right. It depends very much on what we call espionage, right? Economic espionage, they have a very small role in. ITAR violations, theft of military technology, a little more of a role in, but we see a much stronger role by the numbers by state-owned enterprises and by the PLA. So it depends exactly which area that you're dealing with. But yeah, that's to show you, it's just a phenomenal amount that's engaged, phenomenal number in China that are engaged in, let's use that broad term of espionage.
So can you give a ballpark number? I mean, I know there's no way to know how many spies China has, right? But like ballpark, like what is it compared to, say, the US? Is it like an order of magnitude more, 2 orders of magnitude more?
Yeah, I would say several orders of magnitude more.
Several orders. So we're talking like hundreds of times, at least hundreds of times more.
Yeah, the U.S. functions on intelligence agencies, and their interests are very narrow. Their national security information plans and intentions, right? That's what they that's what they focus on. So China certainly has that, which the Ministry of State Security focuses on, but they're also focusing on technology. They're also focusing on inside threats, inside secrets, economic secrets, commercial secrets. They focus on a political apparatus and influence operations. The United Front Work Department actually has what we would call case officers, people that actually go overseas, part of the embassies, collect information, as well as use assets to try and manipulate Chinese local diaspora and political figures. So we see an extraordinary number. I mean, they're easily going to be over 100,000 worldwide doing this.
So would you say the difference sort of is like, the U.S. would be trying to use espionage to find out if there's going to be a terrorist attack somewhere in the U.S., whereas China is using espionage to steal intellectual property?
That they're using espionage for both, to find out where the terrorist attack is going to come from, what the U.S. strategic planning is, what's happening in the South China Sea, what U.S. naval deployments look like, as well as, and that's the small part of it. The much larger part of it is the intellectual property being developed by companies. The cutting edge technologies that we are developing. That's the larger part of their effort.
Do you have an idea of like how big of an impact that economic espionage has hit the U.S. with?
Sure. Well, my estimate, and I'll say was the lower estimate. The U.S. government estimate is higher. Mine is about, let's say, near 400 billion a year, 386 billion a year.
400 billion is lowballing it.
Yeah, that's the low ball. The upper
and that's per year,
right? Per year. So do the math on that for any number of years. And
yeah, that's more than I make in a year.
You're damn right.
Yeah, so it really is big business for them.
Well, the solution is for America to start doing economic espionage, and we can steal the technology of how to make knockoff Homer Simpson slippers.
All right. Yeah. The problem is it leaves us in a poor position. Defending is very, very tough. Offensively, the United States doesn't have a policy and never has of doing that type of economic espionage. It's not in our interest to do, so we don't do it. So we really are left in a completely defensive position. So it's like if you're playing basketball and the only thing you do is defend, it doesn't matter how good you are. Eventually your opponents are going to score and score and score again.
You got to get that basketball player a gun.
Yeah. Yeah, that's another great option.
So how is this economic espionage being carried out? Are they airdropping a Chinese spy to sneak into HP laboratories and steal stuff?
So there are a number of different forms of what we call tradecraft, which are the espionage techniques that are used. You have, depending on the target, you have different types of tradecraft that are employed. So things like to ship out illegal or to ship out military equipment or technology with military applications. They'll use front companies. They'll use moving money through other companies. They pretend they're under a cover company to buy for domestic use. Then they ship to a freight forwarding firm, often a place in Germany, Singapore, or something like that, before transshipment to China. Okay. And there are a lot of telltale signs that, you go into in tradecraft of them, not having financing options or training options or things like that, right? Because they don't want it a tail to go back to China. So there are certain types of tradecrafts that are employed under those circumstances. When we look at actual insider threats in companies, it's interesting that most of the economic espionage, the people who commit it on behalf of China are ethnic Chinese. They're in their late 40s, perhaps early 50s. And the story you hear a lot is going back to China. So it's not unusual at all for the person to spend 10 to 20 years inside a U.S. company and then decide they're going to move back to China and start, I'll say, feathering the nest, start moving information over, start moving trade secrets over so that they can set up a business inside China. So that is a very, very common pattern of actions that we see. And when you see something like that, you see a lot of communications going back to friends or relatives, to banking systems, to companies in China. So the little telltale signs the insider threat community would say. And then still more, we have that which occurs in the research or academic world, where people have, let's say, one foot between either camp, in the United States and in China. And they're making money from China by basically using the same research that they've done in the United States and replicating it in China and training Chinese students and getting lab funded. And you can remember the Lieberman case in Boston, where he was getting $50,000 a month, I think it was.
That was a Harvard professor, I believe.
Right, as a Harvard professor. And that was in China, not declared on taxes. And in addition to the apartment he was getting and all the treatment he was getting. So we see a lot of that. We call them shadow labs that they create and do in China. So lots of different methods depending on the type of activity that they're conducting.
And so I guess with the Lieberman case, we have a case where they got an American national to do the work for the Chinese Communist Party. It's not just Chinese nationals. Though a few years ago, I know there was the Trump administration tried to put a ban on Chinese students from military-linked universities coming to the U.S. and studying in fields related to national security.
So I'll tell you a story about that summer, I think it was summer of 2021, when the U.S. government arrested something like 4 Chinese military researchers who had lied about their military affiliations on the visa form said they were from civilian universities and such when they were actually from military universities in China or military institutes. The FBI arrested 4 of them, and almost 1,000 of them fled the country. Wow. There were another 1,000 researchers that just got on planes and left immediately, and they were all military affiliated.
Wow, so the scope really is huge.
Yeah.
And that's not that, I guess, with those kind of military researchers, that's still not even really touching necessarily the kind of economic espionage.
No, it's advancing China's military. And I mean, the crazy part about this is it's not in, they're paying full costs on tuition, which the Chinese government is sponsoring. So it's really not in the academic institutions, a U.S. academics institution, to look very, very detailed or look very hard at the person's background. They're, basically getting tremendous access into our research base. So it really is a threat to the country. So
that seems to be the clearest sign that something fishy is going on. If somebody can afford full tuition in cash.
Right. I mean, I think one of the things that like you look at Ivy Leagues like Harvard, and they, like most of the American students going there get some kind of help with tuition because they have a need-based system. But they expect foreign nationals to pay full tuition. But they've also been, over the last 20 years, heavily getting a lot of mainland Chinese students, right? And I guess the sort of official assumption is that there's lots of wealthy people in China because it has so many millionaires now, and those families can just afford to pay the full tuition.
There are 377,000 students and scholars, Chinese students and scholars, studying in the U.S. 175,000 in Australia, 125,000 or 127,000 in the UK. If 5% were government or military affiliated, in the United States, you're talking what, 18,000? Is that correct? 18,000 people.
That's crazy. And Australia in particular, because Australia has such a small population.
Right.
I mean, it's only like, 20, 30 million people or something in the whole country. And so they proportionally have like 8 or 10 times the number of Chinese students that the U.S. does.
Yes, correct.
So that, because we had interviewed someone from an Australian university who was just basically overwhelmed by threats from like Chinese students, and the University of Queensland was like extremely not only unhelpful, but like actually negative towards this Australian guy for raising awareness about human rights because they didn't want to upset their Chinese students.
Right, because they're getting money in.
Yeah.
That's the way it is.